Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of Free Kiwis. And today we're very fortunate to have with us Patrick Corish, who works for the Free Speech Coalition.
Well, not so much work anymore, but a member.
A member,
Yeah.
a member of the Free Speech Coalition. Well, we both first met you, I think, when we appeared on the Free Speech Coalition podcast. So at one point you were doing their podcast. Are you not doing their podcast anymore?
Periodically, yes.
Periodically, okay. Once in a while. So this is a podcast that is for New Zealand thinking. I think we put in the first description, and free thinking. And so obviously the Free Speech Coalition is a group that we see as an ally to ours and has some of the same concerns as we do about free speech in the university and beyond. So Patrick, thanks for coming on.
Cheers. Thank you for having me.
And I actually just wanted to start by asking you how did you come to New Zealand, and how did you get into that line of work, which you just told me you're not in precisely anymore? But
just a family. We just moved over about 8 years or so now, and finished college. Moved up to Wellington to study law at Victoria University, and fell in with like-minded classical liberals, and one day we formed the Free Speech Coalition. And,
This was that in the aftermath of Don Brash being banned from
that was
Massey
beforehand.
University?
The specific event which was the motivation to form the Free Speech Coalition was the banning of Stefan Molyneux and Lauren Southern from speaking at a public venue in Auckland. At the time, the Mayor Goff of Auckland had posted tweets suggesting that, which insinuated that he had made the decision that they were to be banned. We then formed the coalition over the weekend and raised enough money to have an launch for an interim injunction to stop that. We were of the opinion that it is illegal to just outright ban people from speaking at a public venue.
Yeah. And the Free Speech Coalition at that time, is it fair to say it comprised people from across the political spectrum? So
Yeah.
people like Stephen Franks and Chris Trotter, was he part of it?
Is he still a member? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. That was our intention. It was a coalition of people on the right and left of the political spectrum. We don't identify as a right-wing organization, despite what some might think, some of our detractors claim. We are a broad church, and we like to keep it that way because we think that free speech is something that should concern all Kiwis instead of providing for just a platform for right-wingers to speak their opinions.
Yeah, it's an interesting case, I think, with Molyneux and Southern, because there's a very simple point here, but it's a point that seems to be getting lost, which is that pretty obviously, I would think, you don't actually need to agree with somebody to defend their right to have their say. And I think the Molyneux and Southern case is interesting for that reason, because we were talking about this a bit before. I mean, there's lots that Molyneux says, that Southern says and does that we wouldn't say or do ourselves, or we don't particularly agree with. But, if that's a standard that we applied to everybody, no one would be able to say anything. And then the only other option is to sort of partially apply it to one bit of society, but then that just kind of looks like domination and some kind of bullying, right? So the only real answer is let everyone have their say. And then if you think that their ideas that are held by Molyneux and Southern or others that are stupid and harmful, you can say that.
Yeah.
Right? It seems pretty simple.
It puts the individual in the driver's seat, really. We tend to trust people. We'd like to trust people to make their own decisions and come to their own conclusions on what is right and correct, or what should be listened to, or what should be ridiculed. What we're seeing nowadays is a small, increasingly smaller and smaller cabal of people deciding what is inappropriate for the layman to listen to, and we find it abhorrent.
It's quite reminiscent in many ways of the medieval Catholic Church, isn't it? There's a sort of priesthood, self-appointed as they may be, who seem to think that it's their moral right and duty to decide what other people ought to be able to say. Is quite astonishing. And also the the point you noted before, that there's some kind of assumption that an organisation that promotes free speech is ipso facto right wing, where actually it was more the province of the left in the 1960s and 70s to be championing free speech. This is something we discussed with Barley Hark in our last podcast. And I suppose perhaps which way that goes depends on who is seen to be the dominant political force at a particular time, and who it is that's being censored.
Yeah.
So at the moment, it's mostly, although not exclusively, people on the right, as it were, who are being shut down, and so therefore defending their right to speak gets seen as a right-wing thing, whereas in the 60s and 70s it was the civil rights activists and so on who were fighting for the right to express themselves.
I think a lot of the times once a particular ideology or school of thought becomes the most dominant one, it becomes lazy because the majority of people hold it. And so you don't need to try as hard to convince people. And so I think that you switch tactics from having compelling arguments and then refocus your efforts on snuffing out any compelling arguments going against what you're saying. I think that's one of the ideas that no, it wasn't John Locke. It was who wrote the
John Stuart Mill?
Yes, that's right. John Stuart Mill saying that, it's good to have a dialectic because, even if I'm proven wrong, even if I risk being proven wrong, my arguments get stronger. I'll have to reevaluate, my line of thinking. When you become the dominant school of thought, I don't think that you have to work as hard at that way.
I suppose if you see as the object of a conversation to dominate or to win or to convince the other person that you're right and they're wrong, then that has a logic to it. But I think what Mill was getting at with that idea that actually we improve everybody's thinking through kind of structured disagreement. So, our politics is built on that with the government and opposition. Our legal system is built on that with a counsel for the defence and a counsel for the prosecution. Actually, science works that way as well, through free debate and scientists attacking one another's ideas and hopefully their own ideas as well to expose their weaknesses.
Yeah, it's a sort of crucible where all the bad ideas or the false facts are burned away, and the truth is what's left. But I think we're increasingly forgetting that that's the point.
Yeah. So, and on that point, it seems like the current Labour government, which obviously won a significant victory, a majority at the last election, is thinking about bringing in some kind of hate speech legislation. And obviously, we have concerns about that. Unfortunately, in the last podcast with Wally Hack, it wasn't his fault. It was more our fault. We hadn't quite done our homework, and we weren't able to really describe what's actually going on with that. You're a trained lawyer, and I thought maybe we could ask you about this. What do you know about these hate speech laws that may be coming onto the book soon? What are the Labour government thinking? Do we know more about that?
Well, there's not much out there except that there's an initiative within the Ministry of Justice to look into hate speech laws with directed focus on recommendation 40 of the Royal Commission on the Christchurch mosque attack. So I can't tell you what the government will produce or what they will recommend in Parliament because there's nothing on that yet. It's still in the developmental phase. What we can go by is what was recommended by the Royal Commission, which recommended that the only provision on the statute books which could be genuinely called a hate speech law be moved from the Human Rights Act to the Crimes Act.
From the Human Rights Act to the Crimes Act, so that would effectively criminalize hate speech in a way it wasn't before.
Well, it's a crime as it stands. There hasn't been any prosecution under the Human Rights Section 131 yet. there was only been one prosecution under a similar provision, the preceding legislation before the Human Rights Act, which was the Race Relations Act. And there are what the recommendations then make are that the definitions of what is considered hateful, the particular statutory tests are changed, and certain protections that are given under the Human Rights Act are taken away once they're put into the.
I see. Yeah. So how long has that hate speech provision been part of the Human Rights Act?
Oh, since the beginning, since 1993.
93,
Mm-hmm.
So nearly 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what does it actually stipulate at the moment?
Well, at the moment, it says whether or not first you have to have an incitement to. I've got it right here. You have to have an intent to incite racial hostility, in any written word or publication or radio broadcast, and then it has to have the likely effects of bringing a protected class of a racial class into contempt or ill will or strong dislike by the public. What the Royal Commission recommends then is changing the words of exciting racial dislike into stirring up or maintaining or normalizing hatred. Beforehand, the words hatred weren't used in the section. So there are some definitional changes that are going on.
Is it still the case that they have to prove intent?
Yes, it is. Intent is still a qualifier. Yeah.
Okay. Because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that in the UK, intent is not necessarily required for somebody to be prosecuted under their hate speech legislation. Are you aware of that? Or
No, I think intent is still
it is.
I do believe so. Yes.
It's quite a difficult thing to prove, isn't it? Intent. I mean, how do you prove that somebody intended to do these horrible things as opposed to it just being an unfortunate byproduct of what they said?
Well, I would assume that when a jury is given the facts, they will come to their what they deem as the rightful conclusion, whether or not the one accused in their mind had the intent to say the things that they did or to spread hatred. Yeah, it would just come down to whether or not a jury thinks that intent was found. It's just an element that the jury finds as fact.
Well, it's good to talk to you because I think there are a couple things going on here with hate speech legislation, as with lots of legislation. One is what the legislation actually says. Well, maybe even three things. One is what the legislation actually says. One is how it's sort of operationalized in courts, what courts actually do with it. And the third is how people perceive it and how they alter their behavior in accordance with how they perceive it. And it's interesting that in the case of Jim Flynn, who died recently, the great psychologist at the University of Otago, another import from North America, he recently published a book, or eventually he published a book. It was about free speech in universities. You must have heard of this case. And Michael and I and a few other academics, Jamin Halberstadt and Marianne Gary, and I think Andy Fosnatch, we wrote into the Dominion Post about this. And that case was interesting because the original publisher who'd agreed to publish Flynn's book was Emerald Publishers in the UK. They wrote to him and said, actually, we're not going to publish it. And there were two reasons for that. One was because they said, we might get in trouble with the courts. And what they said was, we're not sure that intent is going to be relevant. So I think that made it clear that they at least had the impression that under UK law, intention wasn't strong enough to defend you. And the second thing they feared was that with the current climate on social media, people would be taking snippets from this book and sharing them in a way that would expose Emerald Publishers to legal repercussions.
And reputational risk. I think that was part of their rationale as well. It wasn't just legal, it was reputational.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, and I'm talking about the legal thing in particular, because I mean, we're talking about hate speech laws.
The
But I mean, the
laws.
reputation thing
Yeah.
is obviously a big part of the problem with free speech at the moment. That
Mm.
we also need a culture of free speech. But just to keep with the laws for the time being, I mean, I guess hopefully in New Zealand we can make it very clear if this does come in some modified form, it can be made very clear that intent actually does matter, and hopefully there'll be a reasonably high bar for intent to belittle or hold in contempt a particular group of people.
What the recommendations now say is intent to stir up, maintain, or normalize hatred. So beforehand, as the legislation is right now in the Human Rights Act, is intent to excite hostility or ill will against or bring into contempt. So the intent element is still there, but the idea of excitement to ill will or contempt has been changed to stir up, maintain, or normalize. And this can do several things. It's not. I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing on its face. It'll depend on how the courts interpret it. Stir up, I think, is a strange terminology to put in legislation. It might just be my Americanisms coming out. I don't know. Kiwis might have a different idea of what stir up means.
It doesn't sound like a sort of formal legal term.
The commission's report says that it came directly from the terminology in the UK. Its cousin in the UK. So stirring up might be one linguistic trip up the courts might have to grapple with. Because when I think of stir up, I think of, are you shit stirring? Are you stirring the pot? These have many different meanings and connotations that, it is difficult to anticipate or predict what that would mean. Maintain and normalize were added. Those aren't elements of the UK statute. And the reason why the report, the Royal Commission added these in their recommendation was to address the lacuna or the one issue that the High Court brought to the attention of Section 161 of the Human Rights Act, which is the civil equivalent of the criminal racial disharmony offense, and which is whether or not the statute or the legislation as it stands covers behaviors or hatred that already exists. As the legislation, the language of the legislation isn't how it's defined now is it needs to have a change of behavior. So if there is no behavior, saying if you're preaching to a class of white supremacists, whether or not that pamphlet or whatever communication that you're producing at the moment is captured, because you're not changing any minds, you're just fanning the flames. And so there is concern, and I understand the concern that some language that we feel ought to be, as a society, ought to be captured by legislation like this isn't. So that's why the additions of maintain and normalize are put in the recommendation.
There's also some move to go beyond the scope of the existing legislation, I believe. At the moment, it covers things like race, gender, sexuality.
And not at the moment. It's only on racial grounds.
It's only racial. So they're going to move it to cover these other things, including religion, I believe, or religious affiliation?
Religious affiliation, religious groups will be one of the protected classes. The recommendation doesn't list sexual orientation or gender roles as part of the protected class that their new crimes provision will hold.
The religion one's a very interesting one. As I commented, I think in a column I wrote for some news outlet at the time when this legislation was first mooted, religion differs from the other protected characteristics in that it's a religion is a system of belief, whereas race, sexuality, gender are sort of personal characteristics. So, one
Some
can be
might
a
say
man or a
immutable,
woman
yeah.
or Māori or Pākehā or whatever, and that's sort of what you are. You could say Christianity or Islam or whatever is also part of who you are, but the difference, it seems to me, is that it's a system of beliefs. And if we're saying that a system of beliefs cannot be subject to criticism, that's a step much further than saying that you're not allowed to say nasty things about a category of people. And I'm wondering if there's any attempt in the legislation, or there will be any attempt in the legislation, to distinguish saying nasty things about people on the grounds that they're, for example, Muslims, versus saying nasty things about the religion of Islam in general. Because if we're not allowed to criticize a religion, that's a very different thing than saying we're just not allowed to say mean things about adherents of those religions.
Yeah, I think that would be best left up to the courts, and I think as far as the recommendation is concerned, that will be left up to the courts. I believe that the Royal Commission thinks that that their recommendation is clear enough to separate the practitioner from the practice. Whether or not you define what you define as hate, or whether or not you can separate the practitioner from the practice in any given fact scenario, will be a matter for the courts to decide. I can definitely see how, with many people, and understandably so, seeing their faith as an inseparable part of their identity, there will be people, I think, that will think that they're being personally attacked, and that's something for the courts to decide.
Yeah. So just, it's a related question to Michael's, but I'll go back to a couple of episodes ago when we had Jamie White on, and his question was, "What do you mean by religion?" Or I think what he said was, "Who's to say what a religion is?" And this is actually a live question, I believe, in the law in different countries, because various nations, I think, have to come to an official definition of what religions are, especially Germany, that even has a system of taxation connected to churches. So, I mean, there are lots of systems of belief that are kind of religion-like. And when I teach ancient political thought, I talk about Stoicism and Epicureanism, and I say they're kind of like worldviews, but they're also sort of like religions. And it's not just ancient history, of course. Not that I like that phrase. It's just ancient history, because, of course, ancient history is hugely important. But there was a case recently, I think in the UK, where a guy said that he was being discriminated against because of his Stoic beliefs. And I don't remember exactly how he got into trouble for his Stoic beliefs, but he claimed that that was an instance of religious discrimination. So the New Zealand courts are going to be burdened by this type of problem, aren't they, if they bring in
Oh, I
laws about
think so.
religion?
I don't know whether or not there already is either a statutory or a common law test for what religion is. If there is, I'm sure that it will be used. If there isn't, I'm sure it will be created, because that would be. I think that's essential for the analysis of whether or not a crimes offense is committed on that specific ground.
Right, but then it's interesting, because then you get extra protection for your views if you can characterize them, or if they can easily be characterized as a religion, right? So if your Stoicism passes whatever the religion test is, then you can take legal action against people who abuse you for your Stoicism. But if for whatever reason your Epicureanism doesn't meet that test, then you're out of luck. People can abuse you till kingdom come, right?
Yeah, I suppose that might be the case. Whether or not Parliament will think of Epicureans or Stoics when they draft this legislation, I think remains to be seen.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess because I'm an academic, I sort of naturally think of counterexamples, but and you might reply as a sort of practical working lawyer, well, these cases won't come to court, it'll be okay. There's a whole issue of like how much trust we place in these particular institutions. But there's another issue, which is just that if you're framing legislation, I think it's a good idea to make it so that it's actually proof against these kinds of counterexamples, because you sort of never know what's going to happen. And if you can't make it watertight in that way, then I would think that kind of tells against the idea of making legislation like this. But that's just me.
Yeah, I think at the moment the real this was a response to the Christchurch terrorist attack, and understandably, uh, hatred towards Muslims was in the forefront of the commission's mind.
Yeah.
So I think it would probably be the top 5 major religions would have the most protection, but there will be cases, I'm sure, that other sects or other religions that have a smaller congregation will be able to would be protected by this.
Yeah, things could get interesting there because some of these smaller sects or cults, even, which would seem on the face of it to be definitely religions, they believe in supreme beings and so on, and they have some fairly dodgy beliefs about various things. For example, sexual contact with minors and so on is seen as all right in some out there cults. It seems hard to imagine that belief could be in any way protected from criticism.
Oh, I don't. Well, I don't think that the recommendation proposes legislation to protect the religion itself, but hatred against
Against its practitioners.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's interesting too. I mean, let's just push that distinction a little bit, because it seems to me that sometimes in practice it will be difficult to separate those two things. So if you're saying, well, you can criticize beliefs, but you can't criticize people, I mean, I think in intellectual life as it's conducted now, there are a lot of claims about particular people. So one thing that we brought up in a previous episode was people often say, well, men are very violent. Men are more violent, they commit more violent crimes. And that's true. Now, is that a criticism of ideas? Not really. It's actually criticism of people. And I'm not saying, I'm very much not saying we should ban those kinds of ideas and those kinds of criticism. I think we shouldn't. But you see, we're in the same kind of territory now. Like if we ban language that's likely to, what is it, normalize dislike against certain categories of people. I know what they mean. I mean, I know they're thinking of Muslims in Christchurch and so on and so forth. But again, it seems like there's a slippery slope here. And I mean, there are obvious counterexamples, like serial killers or even, hardened criminals of one sort or the other. If you're a parent and you say to your kids, stay away from those gang members, on some level, it's not like I think all people who've ever been in a gang are evil. I mean, we saw they were doing security for the Christchurch mosque at some point. So I'm not necessarily going there, but you can see why people actually might, in the ordinary course of their lives, say things about certain types of people which could be interpreted as hatred for that group.
Yes.
So why
it is a slippery slope. I agree.
So why criminalize that just because of this particular case in Christchurch, right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah,
Right.
I think there's the general movement that, the report does state that one of the reasons why they wanted to add religion as one of the protected classes is because in many cases it's hard to the interrelation between Islamophobia and people of color is quite profound, and so in many cases it's hard to separate the two. And given that this the worst terrorist attack in New Zealand's history was towards a particular religion and not specifically people of color, was I think the motivation for adding that.
Right. So has the Royal Commission, what kind of empirical evidence has the Royal Commission presented for the idea that if you have hate speech laws, then the incidence of mass shootings goes down? Because presumably we have lots of societies in which there have been stronger or less strong hate speech laws, and we can look at how many shootings there have been. Have they looked at that connection at all?
Not to my knowledge, but they did cite some online hate surveys conducted by NetSafe, and looked at the interrelationship between hate speech and hate crimes. So I think in that case, there was a general assumption that the connection between hate speech and far right extremism and hate actions. One thing led to another.
In the sense that if people were allowed to express hateful ideas, that would bleed over into hateful action.
Yes.
Okay. And that was empirically based, was it? Or was that just, as you said, an assumption?
I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. Because my intuition is that it's actually the opposite of that. And I think, well, there's a kind of logic to that, and there's also some empirical evidence for it, although it's hard to analyze that empirical evidence rigorously because it's not experimental. It's looking at trends in societies over time. So it's just a correlation. However, we might observe that in the Western world in general over the last 50 years or so, where law has been pretty liberal with regard to what we're allowed to say, we have seen a vast decrease in the acceptability of expressing racist ideas. I mean, social acceptability, not legal acceptability. So in the absence of any legislation banning us from doing so, we have kind of regulated ourselves through social forces to see that as increasingly unacceptable.
That's a good point. I think that the counter to that would be that whenever we do have one of these increasingly unlikely exceptions, that they are so profound in society that the state needs to intervene. And I know that you could ask some people who disagree with that, saying that they see violence now everywhere, now more than ever, especially using examples in the United States. Whether or not I don't necessarily agree with that, but it is a live argument.
Well, again, isn't that empirically false? Isn't it the case that violent crime has decreased markedly in the United States since about 1990? I mean, there's data on that, is there not?
Oh, I don't know the statistics.
Right, yeah.
I think that's the case across the developed world. I don't know about the third world, but there has been a marked decrease in violence across the Western world. I'm pretty sure. And there have been various hypotheses put forward to explain that. Some people think it's because we have less lead in our drinking water. Although I've heard some stories about lead in drinking water in New Zealand recently, but in general, we have less lead in our drinking water, certainly than in the Roman Empire. And there's differences in policing. With there's a whole story you could tell about Giuliani in New York, and so on and so forth. And economic growth, some people think, seems to help a great deal.
Yes.
But that's the short term. That's the last few decades. But, if you read Steven Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, which I've mentioned on here before, it seems like there's a long-term historical trend, at least in the West, I think everywhere, that we are getting less violent. And it also seems to be the case that during the time period that Pinker looks at, there have been, more free societies, societies where people are more able to express views, even views that are a little bit uncomfortable that other people find offensive. So, yeah, I hope that the Royal Commission maybe thinks about those kinds of issues more seriously.
Well, the report's over, so I don't think that they'll be considering it any more. So it's the job's up to Parliament now.
All right, because
but at the very least, that tends to suggest that liberal attitudes towards free speech at least does nothing to increase violence. We can't prove, of course, that those liberal attitudes have led to the decreases that James is talking about, because it's just a correlation. It may be that it's incidental, but one might think that if those liberal attitudes and liberal laws regarding speech would lead to more hate speech, which could lead to more hate crime and hate action, that we should see some data that supported that. And it also seems to me, and this is a more intuitive position, but if you have somebody who has hateful views, and those people certainly exist, and they may express those hateful views, and we may hold them in opprobrium for doing so. And I think that's the appropriate response rather than prosecuting them. If we go into the realm of prosecuting them, then arguably what's going to happen is that they'll stop saying those things in public because they don't want to be prosecuted, but they won't stop thinking those things.
No.
And not only that, the internet is,
There'll be there's a great risk that this sort of thing will be driven underground.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. And
Wh-
and once underground, of course, it festers and gets worse, and
Yeah.
the problem can then re-emerge into the public sphere more violently.
The problem is actually quite interesting, considering the our growth of technology concerning end-to-end encryption and blockchains and private networks. I think, especially with the latest interest that everyone has in cryptocurrencies, we are slowly coming to reaching a escape velocity where once private networks are established, and I think that's just going to be that's a technological fact, objective fact that it
Yes.
will happen. It'll be very hard to find people, and these proposals where we want to legislate hatred out of the hearts of men, I don't think can do so.
It's a great phrase. I mean, because it shows how absurd an idea it is to rule that you have to be pure.
Mm. It is. I think it comes down to. Have you read Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Vision?
Not I.
He has this fantastic trilogy of books where he analyzes just different traits between the usual suspects found on the right and left. But there's cross sections of everyone. Some people think that human nature is just set in stone, and we're restricted by our natures, and that includes the capacity to be nasty, vicious, and mean people, cruel people. And there's others that think that we're unrestrained by our natures, and that we can be re-educated, retaught, remolded into our better angels. And it really comes down to that. I think that legislation like this is definitely in the former camp, where if we just eliminate the mechanisms in which these ideas normalize or educate people into being bad, then the problem will go away. Whereas I'm of the camp that that's not the case. In fact, it'll make it harder to find, harder to persuade people, because you don't know who you need to persuade otherwise.
Well, I completely agree, and I also think that there's a third position between human nature as a fixed thing that is not going to change, and the idea that we can engineer people to be good, which is that cultures at least are able to develop ideas over time and to refine what is good behavior and to have codes of behavior and so on that a large majority of people will sign up to. But those things are best brought about through evolutionary forces rather than top-down engineering. So perhaps I like the idea, and tell me what you think about this as a lawyer, that actually the best law comes from codifying what has become socially acceptable anyway. So in other words, by the time we make a law, it should be almost obvious that should be a law, because everybody has been behaving that way, because the society has moved in that direction in terms of what it sees as the right thing to do.
I'm usually a fan of that case. I don't particularly like paternalistic government. However, there are cases where there are arguments to make that we elect our officials to be the best of us and to be forward thinking and tell us that the laws that they are making are for society's benefit, and you'll see.
Even the best of us, though, surely can't be prescient enough to see all of the
No,
consequences.
I don't think so. No.
And that's presupposing we actually get the best of us through this democratic process.
Yeah, there's also an argument to be had that that's what's going on right now. The majority of people actually do agree that we need hate speech laws. I don't think that is the case, but if it is so, especially shown from a labor majority government with a historic turnout, that that we are at that point, that society has genuinely.
Oh, I see. Sorry, is there any evidence, though, that a majority of people think we need hate?
No, there isn't. There isn't one.
I mean, I certainly don't think that we can take the
I think it's
the large
unfalsifiable.
majority.
Yeah,
Well,
but it is
yeah.
but it is a hypothetical.
I mean, surely the large majority the Labor government enjoys can be fairly squarely driven home to COVID, because prior to that they were cruising for a loss, or at least a very tight election.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I like this idea of the law sort of codifies the mores of the society that have already come into being. I mean, I can see how in some ways it's a democratic way of thinking about law, but of course the people can consent to laws not only that reinforce their current mores, they can consent to laws because they think they're a good idea. And one of the reasons they might consent to laws thinking that they're a good idea is if they're liberal laws, i.e. if they appreciate that people come in different shapes and sizes, not only with regard to their physical characteristics, but also with regard to their preferences, and that includes their values. So there is a certain amount of irreducible, what Isaiah Berlin would call value pluralism in societies with any diversity. Even in societies without much diversity in the way that we talk about it today, even if you're in colonial New England, people have the same religion, generally come from the same areas. People just have different ways of looking at the world. And that includes morality. So this is the big danger, I think, with the attempt to sort of make sure the world is a good and a nice place, is that it's always going to depend on one faction's idea of what is nice and what is good. And even if that's the majority's faction, I mean, there are people who are just going to think differently, and we want them to be able to have a free life as well. I mean, of course, this is where the real limits of the law, I think, should lie. Of course, we don't want them to be able to limit other people's liberty or to go over and just bonk them over the head and things like that. But I do think we should be defending their right, to say things that people think are bad, because, this is the whole history of liberalism is predicated on this idea that basically, groups of people were saying, you have to be a Christian of this type. And then more lately, maybe they were saying you have to be a Christian of any type. And now they're saying you have to believe in this new, conception of goodness.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you. And in a society that is diverse as well, that problem gets far worse, of course. And if you have minorities who have different values but still compatible with the society at large, you do run a risk of them being persecuted legally, don't you? And that, as an historian of democracy, what do you think about that? It's something that's, I used to think about it often because of the situation in which homosexuals lived for such a long time in liberal democracies where their relationships were illegal.
Yeah.
And that seemed to me, I mean, first of all, it's completely incompatible with a liberal view of the world. Very, very strange for another thing. But it also exposes in some ways a flaw in democracy, a majoritarian view of democracy, whereby the majority gets to tell minorities that they're unacceptable.
Well, I mean, so once again, we kind of have to be careful about the empirical evidence here. I mean, I know that this is a trope in anti-democratic thinking, and I mean, there's a reason why it has become a trope. I mean, it's not just plucked out of thin air, this whole danger of the tyranny of the majority. But again, I mean, if you look at the societies historically which have been most tolerant, they tend not to be the dictatorships. And what you get with dictatorships is the tyranny of the minority, right? And they're often run by cabals. I mean, even if there's a single dictator, he is often representing a certain tendency within that society. And they can use that pretty brutally to repress minorities in that way. And so it seems like, I think one of the things that the history of democracy suggests is actually that positive liberties are the best guard for negative liberties. And so being able to defend yourself depends on your ability to actually do things. And if you can vote, even if you're a minority, you can maybe make coalitions with other minorities. There seems to be a way often in democracies, to offset these problems. But I think that in a lot of these cases, the answer is democracy, or at least that helps. But when you're talking about, persecution of gays in the past, and the answer to that, I just think, this is something we need to come back to. It's just liberalism. It's just basic,
Yes.
old-fashioned liberalism. Just allow people to live their lives unless they're hurting other people.
But going back to what Patrick said before, is you can't legislate liberal values either. We might think that liberal values are a really good way to give everybody maximum liberty and maximum scope to be who they are. But no more can we legislate that people must be liberal than we can legislate that they must be Christians or any other thing that might take somebody might think is a good thing.
Yeah, David Hume, I think, famously said that a man can't wish to wish something. Had I wished not to eat, that I didn't desire chocolate cake, then I'd be the thinnest man on earth. But I can't do that. I think most of the benefits of most of the protections of minorities, like that you were saying, I think come from general rights, and saying that the majority can pass any law it sees fit, except for ones that encroach on these particular things, which are held to be sacred. Those are generally, I think, pretty robust fail-safes from any law which we would think as being illiberal. But then again, in many democracies, you have, legislation or ways of viewing rights where those rights can be limited reasonably justifiably in a free and democratic society. But then again, well, what is reasonable and justifiable? That will depend on who's in power at the time.
Isn't it true, though, that New Zealand differs, for example, to the United States in that the United States Constitution, in some sense, is meta law? It can override any other legislation. The Supreme Court can decide that a particular piece of legislation violates the Constitution, and they can throw it out as a result. Whereas, to my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, the Bill of Rights isn't like that. That other legislation can, in fact, override the Bill of Rights.
That's correct. Parliament is sovereign, and any act that it passes, can be enforced. The Bill of Rights Act is more like a lens in which rights are established, but also protected. It governs how other legislation ought to be interpreted in the best light that is consistent with the rights that it establishes, in cases that it can. But in certain cases where a right is breached by any legislation passed by Parliament, the courts can do nothing but declare it to be inconsistent. So there is a stark difference between what the courts can do here and what the courts can do in the United States.
Yes.
And well, thanks very much for giving us that rundown, as you did a while back, of the Royal Commission report. I was wondering, because I haven't been following it as closely as I should have, but did the Free Speech Coalition put out a response or a strategy directly in response to that?
I can't, not off the top of my head, I can't remember. But we will be, we are watching Parliament's, the government's development of this speech, and we will be following it very closely. We can guarantee that we'll be saying something.
Do you think the Free Speech Coalition is the broad political church we would like it to be? Does it comprise still people from across the political spectrum?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And hopefully increasingly so. And I think that you'll find that as soon as hate speech laws are proposed by the government, you'll see more people on both the right and the left joining our ranks. Or at least that's the hope.
We hope so.
Yeah.
And can you tell us maybe? I mean, you just said at the beginning you're not an employee anymore of the Free Speech Coalition, but you are still a member.
A member, yeah.
And you've been active with it in the past. So, can you tell us more, maybe from the inside, about the general strategy of this group and what it hopes to do and how it's going about it?
I can't give you anything set in stone, but the basic thrust of the coalition is watching governmental action, and it really just depends on what's going on in the state sector at the time. And I think that in this next year there will be a great deal to comment on. So we are run by a steering group which follows the news quite closely, and then we decide on what stories merit comment on.
Great. And if people are listening to this and are, seized with a fire to defend some of the fundamental values of what Karl Popper called an open society, if people are listening and they feel inspired to do something about free speech and to protect it by engaging with your group, how would they? Is there a way to sort of join you and follow along?
You can go to www.freespeechcoalition.nz. When we have a join page, you can fill out your information and be part of our newsletter, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook.
Good stuff. Do you have other questions? It seems to have come to a natural end.
Yeah, I think that this has been an excellent conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, Patrick. It's good to talk to you again, and we definitely must keep in touch. And mentioning that social media thing, the Free Kiwis podcast now has its own Twitter page. So
very good.
We should no doubt follow one another. And
Absolutely.
So on. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been an honor. Thank you.
And thanks for doing that deep dive into the Royal Commission report.
Cheers. Thank you.